Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Susan Yu. They weren't expected to last 3 weeks, but they did. In fact, they lasted 6 months. A band of young Americans secretly defended China against Japanese bombings during the Sino-Japanese War. They stopped the Japanese from invading Western China, winning the hearts of the Chinese people. This is their story.
They thought that the Chinese cause was just. They were fighting against a barbaric enemy.
But at that time, the Japanese had been winning everything, and when they came, they were the first ones that really stopped the Japanese.
On the night of July 7, 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking, the Jap war machine struck.
My sympathies, of course, were with the Chinese people because of the atrocities that I had seen in our newsreels and so forth that the Japanese had subjected the Chinese people to. And one very impressive picture I saw was this little baby in the railway station, I think, in Shanghai.
The Japanese had come in and had bombed right into the city. And there were many, many people dead, civilians. I'd say maybe a couple of hundred. Kids with legs blown off and arms blown off. And so that's when I really realized what the war is all about.
I was an exchange student at Lingnan University in Canton, China. I wanted to go back and help. I knew they needed help.
China has always been at war, and my mom was born of an age where there were always turmoil and unsettlement, and people were always refugees running around from one part of China to another, or one city to another, or from the north to the south, or vice versa. So Chinese people did not have a safe, content, secure way of life.
At that time, certainly England had their back against the wall. Hitler was advancing in Europe, and that was and because of the warm relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt. Roosevelt through his initial support to the war in Europe.
America almost ignored the Sino-Japanese War. They didn't, and to the Chinese that was a pretty serious war going on. They were losing their country.
General Chennault was invited to China by Madame Jiang and President Chiang Kai-shek to visit and to observe and see what he
could do to help the Chinese to organize the Air Force. And that was 1937.
July 23, 1937. First meeting with Generalissimo. Conference with the world's leading lady. Greatly encouraged by conference with Madam. China cannot be defeated while she leads.
There was mutual admirations between the two of them. And General Chennault was so glad to be able to help the Chinese. And I think Madame Jiang and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek really appreciate that.
July 26, 1937. All units on alert. Tension considerable. The Chinese are not ready for war. August 30, 1937. Jap pursuit reported superior in performance to Hawks. Chinese pilots are most properly afraid of them. Japs have teamwork. Chinese, none at all.
It was one-sided. I mean, Japanese had modern carriers sitting off right off the port of Shanghai and places like that, and with aircraft carriers and modern Navy Zeros and Zeeks and stuff. But Chinese were no match at all to that.
Every day must be want to go duck out. No water. But Japanese airplane, he's come from Hankou, Shanghai plane, maybe 30, maybe 100, maybe 150, bang, 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 bang. Water pipe broken, no water, electric line, everything going out. Sometimes no lunch, no food.
The Japanese were bombing Chongqing on a regular basis, which was then the provisional capital of China. And every day, every night, they were getting bombed. And you know, this is a, and America didn't really follow it.
April 15, 1941, an unpublicized executive order went out under his signature, authorizing reserve officers and enlisted men to resign from the Army Air Corps, Naval and Marine Services for the purpose of joining the American Volunteer Group in China.
And I thought, my God, this is a godsend, because I said, what a marvelous way to see that fabled lands, those fabled lands of India and Burma, and to get paid a very handsome salary to fly fighters and help defend the Burma Road.
I'd always wanted to get back to the Far East, and I was born in Korea. My father was a missionary there, and I heard him talk about Korea and talk about the Japanese. You know, he had a real problem with the Japanese occupied Korea at that time when I was born.
I had no idea of anything about it except that it was a faraway land at that time. You know, it even took a long time to get there.
And the first chance I had to get back was the recruiting for the American Volunteer Group. So I said, I'll go. And within 24 hours, I was on my way to China.
When I heard that the Chinese wanted people to help protect the Burma Road in some of the cities, I thought that this was a good chance of getting back into pursuit aviation. If I didn't have any sympathy for the Chinese, I would never have gone.
Number one, Chennault was not permitted to recruit any regular officers. We were all reserves, except for one or two, who were really non-persona grata with their own services, and they were glad to see him go.
I heard about it, and went down and was interviewed, and a few weeks later I was a civilian on my way to China.
Roosevelt set up this dummy corporation, Camco, and they paid for everything with the American Volunteer Group.
Yes, it was covert. And we all had tasks on our passports. We were given bogus jobs. I was going over as an assistant plantation owner.
I was an accountant. and I say I don't know why they ever put that on, because I have a hard time keeping my checkbook in balance.
They had me down as a rancher, but a lot of them were acrobats, and they had all kind of things on their fake passports, you know.
It took direct personal intervention from President Roosevelt to pry the pilots and ground crew from the Army and the Navy.
The brass weren't very happy about that. They thought they'd need these fellas for their work in Europe.
There was only about 300 people, pilots and some technicians. Very, very small. And the United States was not involved fighting against the Japanese.
Before I sailed from San Francisco, I was given some money to purchase some movie equipment, 16mm camera, and a bunch of film, and to do with what I wanted to sort of document the whole thing.
Well, the boat ride took its toll on us, really. We were drinking a lot of whiskey, and in my ship we had about half missionaries and half AVG people. I don't know who converted who on the way over there.
They looked like they had just barely survived adolescence. They were good-looking boys, but these are the people who are going to defend the Bremer Road?
The guys played deck tennis, and some of them played cards, and we spent a little time at the bar, and of course we had a great time when we were crossing the equator. Spent a little time at the bar, and of course we had a great time when we were crossing the equator.
It was funny, the first time I had a medical experience with these fellows, we lined them up on the deck to get their shots. And some of these big, burly fellas, when they looked at that needle, they landed on the deck.
Of course, at that time, she wasn't, whoever it was, I don't know, but it was a woman who broadcast, and later on, she became known as Tokyo Rose. She broadcast that she knew about this boatload of men who were going over to China, and that this boat would never arrive.
Right on the docks at Rangoon, yeah, they came in crates, and they set them up there, and then our guys would go from Tungu when they'd get one put together, and they'd go down there and ferry it back up to Tungu. Then they would paint it and all that stuff.
The British didn't turn them down because the planes were obsolete. They turned them down because they had no pilots to fly them. They'd lost so many pilots in the Battle of Britain that they needed training time.
And they didn't want anything to change the system. Of course, the Japanese were about to change their system, but they resented the Americans coming in as a bunch of, particularly when they were civilians. They weren't even military.
We were based 180 miles north of Rangoon on the railroad at a town called Tungu. That was our training base where we had taken over an auxiliary RAF airfield.
The water was all pumped by little hand-operated pumps and coolies. The barracks were made out of bamboo and attab.
You can't believe how many insects. Matter of fact, they used to bring our meals in 2 plates. They'd have one here with your food in and another plate over it. Or then you'd have to take that plate off and really start eating fast, you know, keep the insects off of it.
When we first got there in Burma, we had curried breakfast, curried lunch, curried dinner. But they finally got us the Chinese who cook American food for us, and then life became much better.
There were 1 or 2 people who got over there and said, this ain't for me, but there were at most 3 who picked up and left.
August 22, 1941. found conditions very unsatisfactory among American personnel. Apparently, agitators have stirred up resentment against military discipline and against volunteer combat service. Made long talk in PM explaining setup and conditions.
I think at first they resented the fact that he was a tough guy. He didn't want to put up with any nonsense. A lot of these guys were all fighter pilots and from the services, and they came over there and they thought, who the hell is this guy? And no, we never heard of him.
The first impression was, here's a guy that's strong. His features indicate that. But he impressed me as here's a guy that really knows what he's doing.
We called him the old man, not to his face, but not out of any kind of disrespect, actually kind of out of reverence, because to us he was an old man at the time.
He was not an artist, but he drew the pictures and the outline of sort of an airplane or something like that. And he drew where the guns were, how they would traverse, and the areas to avoid, and like coming up into the belly and things like this, telling us speeds of the different Japanese airplanes and the vulnerability of them.
But we had all this information. We also had complete information on the Japanese Zero airplane. And where did Chenault get this? The Japanese lost one in their operations around Shanghai very early.
Because of his tactical lectures, we only lost 4 pilots in aerial combat. What you do is you just don't turn with the guy. You just hit him and right down. But the minute you start to turn, you start losing airspeed. And our airplane is real heavy, and so you try to dive away, and these guys had very light wing loading. They could pull on you and catch you before you could get speed up.
Each squadron was originally designated with 33 aircraft. By the time we got through training and ready to go into combat, we probably had 25 planes apiece, but never more than 12 or 13 operational at any one time in any one squadron.
Well, we had a lot of accidents. There weren't very many people in our group that had ever flown a P-40. As a matter of fact, those of us from the Navy and Marine Corps hadn't even seen a P-40 probably.
When they first began to fly out of Taungoo in Burma, they were just olive drab colored P-40s. They didn't have any distinct markings on them.
I had seen a picture of Messerschmitt 110 with shark's mouth on it. They call themselves a high fish group, a group of which is shark in German. And I thought that the P-40 almost looked like a shark without the mouth drawn on it. And so I went out the next morning and drew it in chalk. And so I went to the general, colonel at that time, and I asked him if we could use it as a squadron insignia. And he came out to my airplane and he looked at it and he said, no, I'd rather have it for all of the airplanes.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense.
As I walked across the field, one of our radio men dashed across the turf, waving a message frantically. It was the news of Pearl Harbor, intercepted from an American radio news flash. The rising tide of the Pacific War had at last engulfed the United States and overtaken our American volunteer group.
I was with Chenault when we got the word of Pearl Harbor, and I could see a glint of satisfaction when he said that, well, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. I could see just a glint of saying, well, we're at those so-and-sos now.
As soon as the war was declared, we knew it was really business. There was more cohesion, there was more discipline, everything changed.
And then I flew to the north and took photographs of Don Mueang Airport. And at that time, I don't know whether they were all Japanese or not, but there were 92 airplanes on the airfield that early in the war. The Japanese had already moved into Thailand just within a day or two of Pearl Harbor.
Schilling photographed the docks and airfields of Bangkok from 26,000 feet. When I saw his pictures, I exploded. Docks along the Menam River were jammed with enemy transports, discouraging troops and supplies. Don Mueang Aerodrome, outside the city, was packed with Japanese aircraft, parking wingtip to wingtip and waiting for dispersal to the chain of advanced bases closer to the Burma border.
Chennault decided, with the consent of the Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek, to send one squadron to Rangoon to help defend Rangoon, and then the other two squadrons would later move en masse to Kunming, which was our destination in terms of the basic planning of where we would eventually be to defend the Burma Road.
When they had bombed that day, it was the 18th of December. It was a pretty bad sight downtown, a lot of bodies and, burning buildings. What happened is that they used to use Kunming as a training run for their new pilots because there was no opposition. They'd send 9 planes over to bomb the city.
Chennault had figured out a very good warning system because he had the Chinese telephone or radio when they saw any planes flying over. So we could check the planes as they went over, and we knew how fast they were going, how many planes, so we could get ready.
Which, wasn't radar, but it had certain attributes that radar didn't have. First place, it could work at low altitude, and it was just a number of stations with communications, and I hear an airplane, and see an airplane, there's 6 of them, The air plot could just track the enemy formation right in.
And pretty soon those flags start to line up, and then you knew they were coming in. It was very accurate.
In fact, there was an observer down at Hanoi, and these are the guys that attacked Kunming. And he was on a hill somewhere overlooking the airfield. And before they even took off, he could warn Kunming they were coming, they're warming up.
Last week, we told you about a group of American volunteers that was secretly recruited to help China during the Sino-Japanese War. They had hardly any training on the fighter planes they were expected to fly. Mishaps in the air and on the ground reduced the number of aircraft at their disposal, leaving many of them worried they wouldn't stand a chance against Japan's mighty Air Force. Now, in this week's episode, you'll see how, despite their limited resources, the American Volunteer Group, or AVG, managed to score impressive victories against the enemy.
This was the decisive moment that I was waiting for more than 4 years. American pilots in American fighter planes aided by Chinese ground warning net about to tackle a formation of the Imperial Japanese Air Force.
We caught up with this formation of 10 bombers, and I just kept shooting and shooting, and at the last second I shoved the stick forward, barely missed running into him. I don't know how I missed him to this day, but I can see in my mind's eye the camouflage pattern, the rivets, and that rear gunner. There's a rear gunner in the tail. I had shot his lower jaw away and he slumped over the gun. So that was the first encounter, and I was the first AVGer to shoot down an enemy plane.
Right away, a couple of them were shot down in flames, and then they turned and dropped their bombs and started going back to Hanoi.
But the man who was the observer, when he got back to his base there, he said he went in and told the CO that they needed more training. But he said that he knew they were, even though we were flying with the Chinese Air Force insignia and as Chinese Air Force members, he said he could see when they got up so close, he could see the faces. He knew they wasn't the Chinese Air Force, that there were Americans in there flying them.
When the fellows landed at the base, they got a big welcome by the Chinese. It was the first time that somebody had come to help them, and they weren't bombed by the Japanese. They were so glad.
Because they never came back to Kunming for over a year. That saved that town. We stopped them in Chongqing also. They were bombing the populace there real heavy.
On the drive from the airport in Kunming back to our billets, you'd go by and all these little Chinese children would say, "Ding hao, ding hao."
Then we realized that Chinese had a thing about tigers. The shark's tooth became the tiger. They were so delighted that somebody was there to help that we became the Flying Tigers. The Chinese really are the one who called us the Flying Tigers.
Before I left the United States in the summer of 1941, I asked a few friends in Louisiana to watch the newspapers and send me any clippings about the AVG. Now I was being swamped with clippings from stateside newspapers, and my men were astonished to find themselves world famous as the Flying Tigers.
During the war, the Disney studios would make logos for any military group that asked for them. And so by then we'd been called Flying Tigers. So he designed and made that logo we have that was the V for Victory with the tiger flying through it with the little wings on.
Although the AVG was bloodied over China, it was the air battles over Rangoon that stamped the hallmark of its fame as the Flying Tigers.
They came in with a real big force of airplanes, maybe 80 or 90 airplanes, and the guys shot down a whole bunch that day. I think they shot down around 20 some airplanes.
2 days before Christmas, the Japanese shot their first aerial bolt against Rangoon with 54 bombers escorted by 20 fighters.
Well, the RAF was kind of standoffish at first. You know, they were the big cheeses out there, and we were kind of interlopers coming in and getting in their way, theoretically, until after the first battle in Rangoon, why they kind of looked down on us.
They were not too impressed with the Americans. Of course, we were a bunch of crazy kids to begin with. But when they saw how well we were doing against the Japs, the respect for our group increased.
I knew a couple of them real well, and yes, it was like losing a good friend, but the situation was that you didn't dwell on it in those days.
One of the things that I'll never forget is when the squadrons went down to Rangoon to protect Rangoon, and when those fellows came back, they had aged 10 years overnight.
On a cloudless Christmas day, with a temperature at 115 degrees in the sun, the Japanese came back to finish off Rangoon. They figured 60 bombers and 30 fighters would be ample for the job. This time, 12 P-40s were waiting at altitude and sailed into the Japanese formation as they droned toward the city. Like rowboats attacking the Spanish Armada, one observer on the ground described the attack.
After the initial battles over Rangoon, why, the Japs were just plain stopped. They lost. They quit. They called in reinforcements from the Philippines and from Singapore, Malaya, and Indochina.
This tiny force met a total of 1,000-odd Japanese aircraft over southern Burma and Thailand. In 31 encounters, they destroyed 217 enemy planes and probably destroyed 43. Our losses in combat were 4 pilots killed in the air, 1 while strafing, and 1 taken prisoner.
Chennault, after the first fight, 3 fights, the one over Kunming and the 2 over Rangoon, sent a treatise, a 4-page outline of what we had done back to the Army Air Corps in Washington. And that information was never disseminated, and we have often wondered, those of us in the AVG, how many pilots, including the Philippines, in Java, New Guinea, Australia, had they been informed of that tactic in fighting the Japanese fighter, how many would have survived?
The AVG took the offensive, prowling the enemy fields in Thailand to smash their planes on the ground.
So we started aggressively running attacks on the Japanese air base. We were reasonably successful.
I wanted to go back the next day, you know, right away. And Charlie said, Tex, he said, you're trying to hog all of the missions. He said, I'm going to take this one.
We rather underestimated what happens when you come within range of the automatic weapons and rifles.
He got shot down on the first mission, spent 3.5 years on the River Kwai.
I happened to be a prize pig. I was the first one they got.
In China, over 90% of all downed pilots and crewmen behind the Jap lines escaped with the help of the Chinese citizenry. We had the blood chit, that's something on the back that says, these are American pilots who are here to defend our country against the Japanese. Do all you can to help them and see that they return safely to their unit. Signed, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. That's the essence of what it was.
There are hundreds of American pilots and crewmen alive today who owe their lives to the aid of Chinese farmers, guerrillas, and soldiers who guided them back to safety, knowing full well that the price of detection was death for themselves, their families, and their community.
When I had to land, I was too low to bail out, and so I landed on the side of this mountain. Then early the next morning, I so happened to stop very near a ridge, a trail on the mountain, and here was a Chinese and a young kid, maybe 10 years old. And as they were coming up the trail, I hollered at them. And it frightened them, I guess, because they ran. And then later on, about 20 or 30 came back along with him, and they came up to the airplane. And apparently, I found out later that they thought I was Japanese. See, this was such a remote area in China that they had never seen a Caucasian before in their life. And the word got up to them who I was and that I was fighting for China. And they just between night and day, they couldn't do enough for me. And they built this sedan chair, and we started down the mountain, carrying me, and they wouldn't let me walk. It was an honor.
Some of the British had tried to fight turning fights with the Zeros, and they couldn't do it. And they were losing a lot of airplanes.
Nobody who watched the RAF pilots in action over southern Burma could fail to pay tribute to their bravery. The way these English, Australian, and New Zealand pilots took to the air against every aerial assault on Rangoon, despite a growing realization of the inferiority of their planes and the inadequacy of their tactics, won the admiration of every AVG pilot who fought with them.
The reason we left these different reports was not because we were losing the air battles, but because the soldiers were coming on the ground, the Japanese soldiers.
No replacement pilots reached China. To maintain our thinning ranks, American instructors in the Chinese Yunnan flying schools joined the AVG as combat pilots. Every effort to get help from official American sources met with chilly rebuffs or complete indifference.
There was so little, and he said, make a man cry because they need ammunition, they need supply, but when the supply line reached Kunming, maybe only canned spinach and maybe cigarettes.
The most things we needed over there, we needed bombs, gasoline, and ammunition. We didn't have enough of any of it, particularly gasoline. And Chennault was just pounding on the damn desk day in and day out in that war to get more.
Hap Arnold didn't like it, and he did everything he could possibly do to sink us out there. He even refused his spare parts and all of that right at the beginning when we could have really used them.
We even had people like Eisenhower and calling and telling these guys to get on the ball and help us get supplies.
CNAC was the airline owned by China and Pan American Airlines. They were our sole source of any supply in the AVG that came across the hump.
It was very important because it was the only way out of China. You know, otherwise you'd had to climb the Himalayas because the Japanese were in Burma all the way up to the base of the Himalayas. It was the only way for them to get any supplies in or out. It just kept China going for a while.
They became interlocked. In other words, CNAC couldn't fly unless they were protected from the Jap fighters. The AVGs couldn't fly unless we flew them gasoline, ammunition, parts, engine parts, and everything else they needed.
The only spare parts we received after the war began were 2,000 pounds of solenoids, spark plugs, carburetors, magnetos, etc. CNAC transports flew them from Calcutta to Kunming, where almost every part put a P-40 back into action.
We would have been dead in the water by April of 1942 had it not been for the dedication, the smarts, and the stick-to-itiveness of all of the ground personnel.
I remember Parker Dupuy coming in with about 3 foot of his wing gone. It was a matter of about 4 days that aircraft was back in the air again.
I don't think they got the recognition that they deserved, because if it hadn't been for them, we'd have been out of business in a couple of days. But those guys worked day and night, and they robbed Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, to keep the airplanes in the air.
They did some phenomenal things. We had 2 airplanes in the river, and they retrieved both of them, one of them for spare parts, and the other one they made flyable again. P-40s were worth their weight in gold because there were no replacements.
We had them in China, yeah. They melted out of bamboo, and they're very realistic.
The Chinese would do wonders with airplanes, repairing them and patching battle damage and things like that.
I can remember these big craters in the runway, and they'd come out there, and in a very short period of time, they'd have it covered up, you know. Maybe a couple of hundred people pulling one of those big rollers. And a lot of our runways were made that way. Small, like gravel, they'd take these big boulders and bring them out to the village, and the whole village sit around, the kids and everybody pecking on them, make little bitty ones, and that's where we got our gravel.
It was on the brink of the Salween Gorge early in May of 1942 that the Japanese strained for a knockout blow. There were no obstacles between the Japanese and Kunming but a broken bridge and the AVG.
The bridge over the Salween had been blasted out.
The Chinese, you know, they sacrificed an awful lot. They blew that bridge up themselves, and they trapped a lot of their own people over there.
General Lissimo Chiang Kai-shek decided that they would have to sacrifice them for the whole of China.
Definitively, I think, no question about it, that the Salween Bridge thing was the turning point in West China, preventing the Japanese from invading China from the west.
And the Burma Road itself was quite narrow, and it was going down, so when a bomb would hit here, it would wipe out quite a bit of the road, so they couldn't go forward and they couldn't retreat, and so all the Japanese trucks and so forth were trapped then, and then we were able to go in and destroy those.
That was something to see, because the whole hillside was almost afire where gas trucks were blowing up and stuff as we were strafing them. And it was like shooting fish in a barrel.
If they had invaded China across that Salween River Bridge, Gorge, they would have gone right into Chongqing, and that would have been the end of the war in China for both the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Americans, and everybody else.
We had the contract, so it was only for a year. So a date that we were to depart was already assigned.
They sent a man over there to recruit us, and he was so obnoxious that most of them were just anxious to get out of there. They just told him to, you know, go jump in the lake. It turned out this man they sent in there was Colonel Bissell, but they made him a general 1 hour or a day, whatever it was, before Chennault, so he would outrank him.
Bissell said that if we didn't join up, no one was to help us return to the States, and that when we arrived back in the States, he would see to it that the draft board was there to meet us, and we would be all put into the Army as buck privates.
So we taught all these little kids, instead of saying Ding Hao, we taught them to say piss on Bissell. So everywhere he went, the kids along the way them up, piss on Bissell, which he wasn't too happy about.
5 did stay over. The rest all said, to hell with this, we're going to leave.
But then some guys, they felt really sorry for Chennault, because everybody was leaving him. And the Air Force, who had disbanded us, hadn't even sent anybody in there to fly the airplanes.
And I was very fond of the old man at that time, so I decided to stay, and I think everybody did on that basis, that they didn't want to let him down.
I was down talking to the old man. He called me in there. He wanted me to go around and get volunteers to extend their contract. And P-TEC came in there, had his suitcase packed. And I told him before he went in, I said, the old man wants us to extend our contract for 2 weeks. And sure. So he turned around, he never even saw the old man.
Pete was going to fly for CNAC. Then Chennault asked the fellows to stay over 10 days until he had a chance to train some of the Army fellows. This is what happened. We stayed in, and it was 10 days is when I lost him.
P-TEC got shot down, yeah. Yeah, that was too bad, because he had just married Emma, and I guess she was pregnant at the time.
When you consider that they started out with a little over 100 pilots, that was narrowed down to around 80 pilots that stayed with them from the beginning until the end during their 6 months of combat duty. And 20 of those made ace status, which is quite a high percentage.
Its reputation alone was sufficient to keep Japanese bombers away from Chongqing. It freed the cities of East China from years of terror bombing, and finally gave both Chinese and American morale an incalculable boost at a time when it was sagging dangerously low. All this cost the Chinese $8 million, about $3 million in salaries and personnel expenses, and $5 million for planes and equipment. I wrote to Dr. Sung my regrets that expenses had exceeded my original estimates. He replied, "The AVG was the soundest investment China ever made. I'm ashamed you even consider it a cost."
And even today, I would be hard-pressed to give any air combat unit that's more famous, even today, 50 and more years later, than the Flying Tigers.
We were disbanded by presidential decree on July the 4th, 1942. Generalissimo and Madame Zhang gave a big farewell in Kunming. It was a big party with food and speeches and thank you notes and banners given and awards given and medals given.
The fellows just drooled because she called them her angels with or without wings.
People came out to see them, and if they even make a movie of the thing, that one of the great scenes will be his farewell to Chennault to the Chinese people in Chongqing, where they pushed his car through the streets. Must have been something.
We were not political. We came over there to help the Chinese, and we saved thousands, I'm convinced, saved thousands of Chinese lives. And the Chinese still today, as I understand it, even teach in school who the Flying Tigers were and what we did for China. And some of them even say that we will never be forgotten because we are part of China's history.